On July 10, 2026, in a hangar in San Javier, Spain, a 20-year-old woman stood in a blue Air Force uniform and received the highest honor the Spanish Air and Space Force can bestow. Her father pinned it to her chest. Her mother watched from the front row. And somewhere in that quiet, overcast ceremony, 3 years of doubt finally ran out of road. Her name is Leonor de Borbón, Princess of Asturias, heir to the Spanish throne. And what happened that day wasn't a single dramatic confrontation. There was no viral comeback, no headline-grabbing clapback at a critic. What happened was slower and, in some ways, more powerful than that. It was the quiet, undeniable arrival of proof. 3 years of proof, delivered in full, in front of the entire country, with nowhere left to hide and nothing left to argue. To understand why that ceremony mattered, you have to go back to August 2023, to a much less certain beginning. Leonor was 17 years old, barely out of secondary school, when the Spanish government approved a royal decree laying out an extraordinary plan. The future Queen of Spain, a role no woman had held in nearly 150 years, would not simply be handed ceremonial titles and photo opportunities. She would go through actual military training. Not a symbolic visit to a base. Not a uniform for a single afternoon of pageantry. She would spend 3 full years rotating through the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, living in the same barracks as other cadets, eating the same food, running the same drills, taking the same exams. When that plan became public, it did not land as an uncontroversial announcement. It landed as a test. A test of whether Spain's youngest and most closely watched royal could actually survive something this demanding, or whether the whole exercise would turn out to be exactly what critics feared, a carefully managed publicity tour dressed up as hardship, with soft landings arranged behind the scenes. That skepticism wasn't irrational. Royal families across Europe have a long history of choreographed toughness. A future king photographed briefly in a cockpit. A future queen shown for one afternoon on a military base, smiling, unbothered, gone by lunchtime. The public has learned, from decades of experience, to read those images as theater. So when Leonor arrived at the General Military Academy in Zaragoza in August 2023, more than a few observers assumed they already knew how this story would end. They assumed wrong, but they didn't know that yet. And for a long stretch of those 3 years, the doubt simply sat there, unresolved, because there was no way to settle it except by watching what she actually did. What she actually did, over the following 36 months, was rack up an accumulation of specifics that are difficult to wave away as image management. In Zaragoza, during that first year, Leonor lived in a dormitory alongside 11 other female cadets. She took part in mountain maneuvers in the Soria province, grueling exercises that test endurance, navigation, and the ability to function under physical exhaustion. She trained in ground combat and basic strategy. She swore an oath of allegiance to the flag, a ceremony considered the defining milestone of a Spanish military career, symbolizing a pledge to defend the country even at the cost of one's own life. That is not a line reserved for royals. Every cadet who takes that oath is making the same promise, and Leonor made it standing in the same formation as everyone else. At the end of that year, her father, King Felipe VI, awarded her the Grand Cross of Military Merit with White Distinction, the same honor he received when he completed his own training decades earlier. Then came the Navy, and the training ship Juan Sebastián de Elcano. This is where the physical realities of the program became harder to dismiss as ceremonial. Leonor shared a small cabin with fellow midshipmen. She stood watch during overnight shifts, 2 in the morning, alone with the responsibilities of the ship, no special exemption for the future queen. She sailed across the Atlantic on a demanding, multi-month voyage that took her from the ports of South America to the east coast of the United States, the vessel functioning as something close to a floating diplomatic mission for Spain. She later spent additional time aboard the frigate Blas de Lezo. At the end of that stretch, she earned the Grand Cross of Naval Merit. And then came Murcia, and the Air Force, arguably the most demanding and most publicly visible chapter of the entire program. At the General Air and Space Academy in San Javier, Leonor moved through a curriculum built around modern flight training, including instruction in drone operations and cyber defense, reflecting the kind of warfare a future commander-in-chief may actually need to understand. In December 2025, she completed her first solo flight, what Spanish military tradition calls La Suelta, alone in a Pilatus PC-21 turboprop trainer, after more than 50 hours of simulator work and theory. In May 2026, the royal household released images of her at the controls of an F-5 fighter jet, training alongside Colonel Daniel Fernandez de Bobadilla Lorenzo at Talavera La Real Air Base, the kind of photograph that, a few years earlier, critics would have assumed was simply impossible for her to earn honestly. Then, in the final weeks before graduation, she went further than either her father or her grandfather ever had. She enrolled in the basic parachuting course at the Mendez Parada Military Parachuting School in Sangonera La Seca, a 2-week program involving physical fitness testing, ground landing training, simulated high-altitude jumps from a training tower, and finally, a real jump from 1,300 feet. Neither King Felipe VI nor King Juan Carlos I ever completed a parachute jump. Leonor did. She became the first member of the Spanish royal family in history to do so, and she qualified as a paratrooper. According to reporting from El Español, she pursued this specific challenge on her own initiative, choosing to follow the same path as her fellow fourth-year cadets rather than requesting anything easier. Throughout the entire 3-year program, multiple outlets covering her training consistently note the same detail. She trained without special treatment, alongside her classmates as an equal, referred to in Zaragoza, informally, simply as Cadet Bourbon Ortiz. This is the pattern worth sitting with, because it's the actual answer to the question the title of this video is asking. There was no single moment where Leonor turned to a camera and delivered a takedown of her doubters. That's not how this story worked, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. What actually happened is that she showed up, week after week, year after year, to training that could not be faked, physical exams that either you pass or you don't, overnight watches that either you stand or you don't, a jump from a plane that either you make or you don't, and she did every single one of them. That accumulation reached its formal conclusion on July 10, 2026, at the graduation ceremony in San Javier. Leonor, 20 years old, received her officer's commission alongside more than 100 fellow cadets. She was awarded the Grand Cross of Aeronautical Merit with White Distinction, presented to her by her father, completing the full set of top military honors from all 3 branches of the Spanish Armed Forces. With that, she became the first woman in Spanish history to complete officer training across the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Colonel Luis Felipe González, director of the Academy, described her performance as outstanding, praising what he called a deep and deliberate capacity for learning, and calling her conduct throughout the course exemplary, citing her integration, her discipline, and her commitment. It's worth being honest about the atmosphere of that day too, because it wasn't a triumphant, celebratory affair. The ceremony unfolded in the shadow of a devastating wildfire that had broken out in Los Gallardos, in the region of Almería, killing at least 12 people with more than 20 still missing at the time. King Felipe addressed the tragedy directly before the ceremony began. The royal family observed a moment of silence. Afterward, the king announced that the traditional graduation reception would be cancelled entirely, out of respect for the victims. So even in the moment that should have been the loudest vindication of 3 years of work, the royal family chose restraint over celebration. That choice says something too, about priorities, about what the monarchy wants to project in a moment of national grief, and about the fact that Leonor's achievement, real as it was never treated as more important than the country it was meant to serve. There's a quieter thread running underneath all of this worth naming directly. Leonor's route to the throne carries a specific historical weight. When she eventually becomes queen, she's expected to be Spain's first reigning queen since Isabella II, who ruled in the 19th century. That means the question of how a female heir establishes authority in institutions that have historically been male-dominated isn't an abstract one for her, it's the practical challenge she's been living through since she was 17. The military program was never only about learning to fly a plane or stand a night watch. It was designed, explicitly, to answer a harder question: can a future queen command genuine respect from the armed forces she will one day formally lead, in a country where that role has always belonged to a king? 3 years of unglamorous, undramatic, thoroughly documented effort is Leonor's answer. Not a viral moment. Not a single quote. A closed loop of proof. A cadet who lived in the dorm, stood the watch, made the jump, and earned the same honors her father earned before her, with no shortcuts anyone has been able to point to. The commission she received in San Javier isn't the end of this story either. Colonel Gonzalez noted that Leonor will return to San Javier in July 2027 to formally receive her Navy commission as well, once the fifth and final year of her academic program concludes. And in the meantime, her path bends towards something entirely different. This autumn, she starts a political science degree at Carlos III University in Getafe, on the same academic footing and the same exam schedule as every other incoming student, without the individually arranged, bespoke path her father followed when he was her age. That, ultimately, is the real story behind a title like, The Moment Leonor Silenced the Critics. It was never one moment. It was 3 years of them, stacked one on top of the other, until the accumulated weight of what she'd actually done made the original skepticism impossible to sustain. Whether that pattern holds as she steps into an entirely different kind of test, the classroom, the political debates, the slower and less physically dramatic work of becoming a modern head of state, is the question this story leaves genuinely open. The training is finished. What she does with it is not.